The Elder Scrolls is a universe of many gods, spirits, and all kinds of supernatural entities. These make the setting a truly magical and wondrous place, and with such tangible evidence of the many gods, atheists would be far and few between here. Just as cultures organize themselves around common material interests, social behaviors, and shared customs, we see that people with shared worship begin organizing themselves into groups that share the same gods and forms of spiritual practice. At the earliest levels, we would see small cults that spring up in localized communities or perhaps gain traction among a larger populace, but soon, as is the nature with most things, some of these cults or religious orders grow larger and begin establishing dominance. And like a society, a business, or any organization for that matter, the larger it gets, the more rules and codified canon it needs to maintain a consistent replication of its identity throughout all of its practitioners. This is where we see hierarchical structures of authority form, and also the development of sacred texts, basically rulebooks for people to refer back to. Then it can get all the more complex later on when you have varying interpretations of those texts and alterations of those rules, and then you end up with various different denominations and splits that follow. But fundamental to a religion's wide-scale success is usually adoption by the state, king, empire, or whatever form of societal power. So for example, the big turnaround for Christianity, the thing that truly took it to the world stage, was the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine to Christianity, as well as its following legalization throughout the empire. In future generations, more Romans became Christian until it was the Roman religion, and Rome quickly became the center of Christianity in Europe. And today, the Vatican City remains within Rome, though independent, and is the headquarters of the Catholic Church. Now, we aren't going to dive into Christianity and its history and such, we're talking about the Elder Scrolls still, but I wanted to preface this video with a little framework, because we're going to be talking about the largest religion in the Elder Scrolls. Welcome to Fudge Muppet, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Scott, and today we are taking a look at the Temple of the Divines, the Imperial Cult, and we are going to analyze just how far its influence spread and how powerful the institution itself is. In our own world, religion has been inseparable from society, and kings, queens, and other rulers have had their claims authenticated by a god or gods through the priestly caste. So tuck yourself in, ladies and gentlemen, because we are going to talk all about the Imperial Cult, how the worship of the divines started, how it authenticates rule, how its influence and power waxed and waned, and how powerful it remains today. So let's get started. First, we are heading way back thousands of years ago to the early First Era, where the slave queen Alicia, with the help of Morahouse, Pelennor Whitestrake, some Aelid nobles, the Nords, and armies of former slaves, together defeated their elven oppressors. It was this time in history where the 8 divines were created and codified by Alicia herself. You see, prior to this, there were the Aldmeri gods, who were worshipped by the Aelids as well as their Nedic slaves, but on the other hand, you had the many Nords who worshipped the Nordic pantheon, and would want nothing to do with the gods of the elves. So Alicia created a synthesis of the two pantheons, combining elements of both, often softening the haughty elven and brutal Nordic parts, creating a more acceptable pantheon of gods for everyone. This was the birth of the 8 divines. Mara, the god of love, was the only shared god of the two pantheons. Stendar was worshipped by the Oldmar, but a more brutal version called Stun was worshipped by the Nords. As a result of the synthesis, we end up with the Stendar we know today, as a god of mercy. Dibella was taken from the Nordic pantheon as a goddess of beauty. Junal, the rune god of the Nords, became Julianos, the divine of wisdom and logic. Kine was adopted as Kinnereth, but is admittedly a much softer version of the Nordic precursor, still a goddess of air, but no longer seen as the warrior wife of shore. The most familiar version of Archaig, the god of the Wheel of Life, at this time would have been the god Orki of the Nords, which also combined elements of Morlock. It is said that Archaig did not exist before the world was created by the gods, so perhaps he was only created at this time, literally, but no one can say for sure. Zenithar, god of commerce, seems to have originated from the Bosmeri god Zen, but has been flavored with the more cultivated civilized crafts and merchants. And finally, we have the trickiest of them all, Akatosh. In history, Akatosh first appears around the time of Alesia. Prior to that, the Nords recognized this Adric entity as Alduin, and the Elves recognized it as Auriel. Akatosh is the dragon god of time that seemingly combines elements of both. And we will get to later how some weird dragon break split happens or supposedly happens. Regardless, if you're left a little confused as to how these interpretations of gods are valid, please do check out the complete guide to gods linked below. But aside from that, if you just accept it for what it is now, you should be fine to understand the rest of this video. It's also worth noting that the missing god, Shor or Lorcan, became Shazar. Shazar, as a result, had to change. He could no longer be the bloodthirsty anti-Aldmer warlord of old. He could not disappear altogether either, or the Nords would have withdrawn their support of her rule. In the end, he had become the spirit behind all human undertaking, even though this was merely a thinly disguised, watered-down version of Shor. It was good enough for the Nords. So Alesia created the 8 divines, not literally, but the interpretations of these Aedra that became the canon of the Imperial Cult. We have Akatosh, Dibella, Mara, Kinnereth, Stendar, Arkay, Zenithar, and Julianos. The shared aspects of both Nordic and Aldmeri made it so that the adoption of this religion happened relatively smoothly, especially with their Holy Queen Alesia personally endorsing it. Now, beyond just the creation of the Imperial Cult, as in the 8 divines, there was another little bit of special sauce that would fundamentally make the empires of Cyrodiil intertwined with the worship of the 8 divines. You see, the chief of the 8 divines, Akatosh, made a sacred pact with Alesia. Akatosh mandated that he would use his power to shut off Oblivion from the mortal realm as long as Alesia's descendants sat upon the throne. Alesia was gifted the dragon blood. She technically became the first dragonborn, and only those with the dragon blood could wear the Amulet of Kings, which ordained all future rightful rulers of Cyrodiil. So you can see how Akatosh and his worship, along with the other 8 divines, now became fundamentally intertwined with the new Alesian Empire of Cyrodiil, and it's a custom and tradition that lasted right up until the end of the Third Era. So it's now the 243rd year of the First Era, and Alesia is the new Empress of Cyrodiil, though not all of it, as its borders are known today, and she implements the 8 divines religion. Alesia rules for 23 years, and in that time the lands become more united and surely more convert and propagate this new 8 divines faith. Balatza the Man-Bull, believed to be the first Minotaur, succeeds his mother as the second Emperor of Cyrodiil. For nearly 100 years, things proceed smoothly enough until the Alesian Order begins rising to prominence. The Alesian Order began when a prophet named Maruk supposedly received visions from Alesia, and essentially this order became a new religion that espoused one true god, and it was also very anti-elven in sentiment. Despite the strict monotheism, the 8 divines, along with many other gods and spirits, were all considered lesser spirits or aspects of this one unknowable god, which they also referred to as the One. Fun fact, the Temple of the One in the Imperial City was originally dedicated to that same one god of the Alesian Order. Funnily enough, the rise of the Alesian Order and its entanglement with the Empire's legal system gave the 8 divines a much larger influence. Throughout the centuries, as the Alesian doctrines became enforced within the Empire and the Empire's influence spread throughout northern Tamriel, so did the 8 divines. The divines became intertwined with the culture of the Alesian Order and also the legal statutes that were implemented. Religion, law, and empire were one, but don't mistake me, the Imperial Cult of the 8 divines still remained a more Cyrodiilic affair. It was the Alesian Order and the worship of the One that was on the world stage, front and foremost. The divines were just a lesser part of that. Interestingly, it was the Marukati Selective, a secret sect of the Alesian Order, that caused one of the biggest metaphysical magical events of the First Era, the Middle Dawn Dragon Break. Part of the reason they did this was to excise all the elven elements from Akatosh, firmly separating Auriel and Akatosh as 2 different beings. You can check out our video linked below on Dragon Breaks if you need to understand more about that, but essentially throughout these tumultuous times of broken time, a lot of whack stuff happens, and so in the aftermath, the Alesian Order is weakened and set upon a slow death, culminating in the War of Righteousness. Ultimately, the Elysian Order and the Empire with it would crumble to ashes. Its former vassal states and integrated kingdoms would declare independence. After the fall, it was clear that the eastern and western halves of Cyrodiil were incredibly culturally divided, and now politically too. Nibene of the East was filled with many cults to all kinds of different gods and spirits, with a very esoteric and magical culture, a relic of the Elysian Order's all-encompassing theocracy. In the West, in Clovia, the people were much more uniform in their worship and traditions, and it is here that the Eight Divines truly flourished. The biggest change that would launch the Eight Divines, the Imperial Cult, into worship Tamriel-wide was the rise of the Riemann Empire. The year 2703 of the First Era was the date of the first Akaviri invasion of Tamriel. Riemann I, a Colovian who united the east and west of Cyrodiil against the Akaviri and defeated them at Pale Pass. Here, the Akaviri recognized him as Dragonborn and pledged their service. This was the birth of the Second Cyrodiilic Empire of Man. Mythology would dictate that he was the product of a coupling between King Hrol and the spirit of Saint Alicia, birthed from the very land itself at Senkator. Regardless whether you believe this or not, he did have the dragon blood and he could wear the Amulet of Kings, therefore verifying his right to rule as emperor, a right that was prominent in the minds of the Cyrodiilic people. So long story short, Riemann creates a brand new empire and incorporates Akaviri culture and military strategy to form the greatest military force on Tamriel, and his dynasty over a few centuries would conquer and consolidate his rule all over Tamriel with the exception of Morrowind. As a consequence of this, the empire's official religion, that of the Eight Divines, spread where the empire went, obviously with varying degrees of success, but nonetheless the Imperial Cult spread far and beyond where it ever had before. Even after the fall of the Riemann dynasty, the Akaviri potentates maintained the empire for centuries afterward, but even that would come to an end in the 430th year of the Second Era. Ultimately, it was the Riemann Empire that transformed Tamriel and spread both its religion and culture to nearly every corner, influencing everywhere it touched. Keyword here is influence. You see, the book's Varieties of Faith in Tamriel were written at some point before the year 580 of the Second Era, which itself is not long after the Riemann Empire collapsed. By this point, the Eight Divines had gained a lot of traction among the Bretons of High Rock, who almost seemingly exclusively worshipped the Eight, like the people of Cyrodiil, and the forebears of Tamriel, who had a good relationship with the Second Empire, essentially worshipped the Eight Divines, with only a tad of Yakuran flavor in depiction and name. It's also reasonable to believe that among the other provinces there were a growing minority worshippers of the Eight Divines. Some seemingly adopted only certain gods' worship, but overall, it had not been cemented yet. You see, it really changes, and I mean really changes, at the end of the Second Era during the Tiber Wars, where Tiber Septum conquers all of Tamriel and brings it under a single ruler, ordained by Akatosh and the Divines, blessed with dragon blood and wearer of the Amulet of Kings. This was an unprecedented accomplishment in Tamriel's history. Arguably the most powerful empire to ever exist, and fundamentally the Imperial Cult and the Empire were intertwined. So the success of the Empire was the success of the Divines' faith. The previous Riemann Empire had already planted seeds throughout all the provinces, and with the Third Empire, the Septum dynasty, these seeds would flourish. Over the centuries of Empire rule, all the provinces became more uniform. The divided east and west of Cyrodiil became very alike, no longer resembling the divided cultures of old. The Imperial Cult was a religion for all. It even gained reasonable traction in Morrowind of all places, towards the end of the Third Era, so it's fair to assume that its purchase among the other provinces had grown much stronger as well. Not necessarily the dominant religion, but definitely the most popular Tamriel-wide. The other big factor was that Tiber Septum himself ascended to the heavens and became the ninth divine. There was now 8 and 1. Talos. This was a massive change, but one that was accepted and would last for centuries. The faith had evolved. The Oblivion crisis was a time of fundamental change. Marcus Septum, the last wearer of the Amulet of Kings, sacrificed himself to shut off Oblivion forever and prevent Mehrunes Dagon's successful invasion. But in doing this, the Septum line was ended and the Amulet of Kings was destroyed. So what did this mean for the Empire? Well, there was the Stormcrown Interregnum and a series of civil wars and successions and civil unrest. But more fundamentally, the Empire was without an emperor that had divine right. There was no dragon blood, no Amulet of Kings, therefore no divine mandate that granted his right to rule the Empire itself. And so there were a lot of disgruntled people and probably disgruntled priests. Titus Mede was essentially a warlord who just came in and said mine. So you can imagine those with respect for tradition and divine authority would be a little angry at the whole fiasco. The Fourth Era basically ends up being a few centuries where the Empire loses territory and disasters happen. And based on what we see in Skyrim though, it seems that the Imperial Cult has slowly become more dominant in the Imperial provinces. Ancient Nordic worship has been mostly imperialized. It's very rare that you will hear the names like Kain or Junal, if at all. Their faith is firmly imperial in culture. It's therefore reasonable to speculate that areas like Hammerfell had also undergone further imperialization. But we haven't yet talked about the Great War. So the Great War breaks out year 171 of the Fourth Era between the Empire and the Aldmeri Dominion. You probably know this well, so put simply, White Gold King Gordit is signed, Hammerfell becomes independent, and Talos worship is outlawed. This stirs the pot quite a bit. I imagine the traditional Yakutan gods of the crowns in Hammerfell have had a bit of a resurgence among the rest of Hammerfell, and I imagine the animosity between the Empire and the Red Guards may have reversed a little bit of the imperialization. However, if we look at Skyrim, despite the Civil War, we can see that both Imperials and the Stormcloaks worship the 8 Divines, all Imperial-flavoured deities, and they merely argue over the inclusion of the 9th. It seems the ancient, culturally distinct versions of the Aedra have been falling out of favour, instead replaced with Imperial deities. So by my best estimate, I'd say that the Imperial Cult is the dominant religion of Cyrodiil, Skyrim, and High Rock, and most likely is still persistent in at least Forebear-controlled Hammerfell, considering that they only dropped from the Empire decades ago, and they've essentially worshipped the 8 Divines since Riemann times. With the regime of the Thalmor in Aldmeri Dominion territories, I would guess that the Imperial Cult members have been snuffed out along with its worshippers, and more Aldmeri-based pantheons reinstituted. But I'd guess that with all the strife of the Fourth Era, people would have flocked to religion for hope, and religious division became less important, resulting in preceding generations to share the same unified faith of the Divines, the Imperial Cult version, that is, even in places like Skyrim. While it may have lost ground in Elven territories and Blackmarsh, I'd argue that the influence of the Imperial Cult has only grown as the Empire has lived on. Arguably, it may be at its peak, not in terms of continental spread, but in terms of consolidation. High Rock and Cyrodiil have always seemingly been of the Imperial faith, but even at the end of the Third Era, you'll find Nords referring to their Nordic pantheon, implying that temples of Skyrim still practice their traditional worship separate from the Imperial Cult. So we know that by the events of Skyrim, the Fourth Era, that the Imperial Cult is powerful. But what of the future? The religious order has certainly undergone some trials and tribulations in the last centuries. The vital connection between Akatosh, the chief of the Divines, and mortal emperors has been severed with the destruction of the Amulet of Kings. Then you must also consider that the fundamental change of 9 to 8 Divines has caused many problems. Allowing a foreign power to dictate your worship is not the Empire's proudest accomplishment. Even though the 8 have been 8 for longer than they were 9, we have to consider that for over 550 years, Talos has been an essential part of the faith. That's about 20 generations of 9 Divines worship. The worship of the 9 is fundamental to the Septum Empire, and remained so until its banning 26 years ago. It may not seem important, but this religious schism between 8 and 9 is the driving force of the civil war in the north, and trust that the Nords are not the only ones who consider him important. A civil war in Cyrodiil is not implausible. The times are rife with potential for conflict. Perhaps you'll see a religious schism of the Imperial Cult, those who worship the Eight and accept the Thalmor's terms, and those Orthodox who worship the Nine Divines. Though due to the nature of the White Gold Concordat, this would necessitate a fracturing of the Empire, perhaps a Byzantine-style Eastern Nibonese Empire that rises from the division, an emperor with Stormcloak allies from the north, mirroring the Varangian Guard of Ruse. Then perhaps the Western Roman-styled Clovian Empire with High Rock and West Skyrim on the other side. Who knows? Probably not, but I'm just fantasizing at this point. Ultimately, we can establish that the Imperial Cult of 8, then 9, then 8 again, is without a doubt the most successful religion on Tamriel, having touched every single province and converted many, as well as existing for over 4,000 years. Very impressive. Thanks so much for watching, guys. What do you guys think about the future of the Imperial Cult? Let me know down in the comments below, and absolutely drop in your 2 cents on the subject. My name is Scott from Fudge Muppet. Thanks again for watching. Like the video if you enjoyed, and I'll be back to nerd out with you again next time.